Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Singapore. Thank you for joining us for the joint webinar organized by the Commonwealth Secretariat and the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. The topic of today's joint panel discussion is Changing Dynamics of Maritime Trade in a Post-COVID-19 World, Implications for South Asia. Before we proceed with the event, we would appreciate it if the audience could mute their microphones and videos throughout the session. You may forward your questions and feedback via the Zoom chat at any point during the session. The questions will be consolidated for the panelists to answer. We are delighted to have with us the following speakers and discussants. Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, Non-Resident Fellow, Senior Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. Dr. Salamat Ali, Trade Economist, Commonwealth Secretariat. Dr. Jivanta Scott-Lee, Assistant Professor in Indian Politics and Foreign Policy, Dublin City University, and Non-Resident Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. Dr. Peggy Cheng Shiling, Head of Maritime and Logistics Management, National Centre for Ports and Shipping, Australian Maritime College, University of Tasmania, Australia. Dr. Brendan Vickers, Head International Trade Policy Section, Commonwealth Secretariat. And chairing the discussion is Dr. Amithendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. I now invite Dr. Palit to deliver this. Dr. Palit, please.
Shavinya, thank you so much for the introduction that you provided us. And let me take this opportunity on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore to welcome you all to today's discussion on a subject that's of fundamental importance to not just those who are engaged with business, but also for those who have some bits of generous water surrounding them in respect to their national spaces. And I'm referring to the oceans and seas around us, which are the lifebloods of trading. And they are more so, as we will see in the discussion that we have today, for the group of Commonwealth countries, the 50 plus of these countries, most of whom are very heavily dependent upon the maritime trade connections they have among themselves and with respect to the rest of the world, which are sources of livelihood and sustenance for them. So I'm really very happy to welcome you all to today's discussion on harnessing maritime trade and reflecting on how such harnessing can enable the Commonwealth economies to utilize some opportunities that have been provided by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that is taking all kinds of different forms and shape across the world, but also to see whether this revival of maritime trade can, in a way, be a source of impetus also for the economic and business revival in some of the Commonwealth countries. And given that we are in the Institute of South Asian Studies, we would particularly be looking forward to learning more about what these insights contain for the South Asian region and the Commonwealth members from the South Asian region. Before I request the distinguished authors of the report to present this, I'd like to share with this audience that we are really from ISAs very, very happy to partner with the Commonwealth Secretariat again on this occasion of today. We have earlier had fruitful partnerships which have the Commonwealth regional consultations being hosted in Singapore at a time when the world was very different. And I do hope that even in the post-pandemic conditions, we'll get more opportunities to work together closely. So without taking more of your time, I would now like to invite Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja and Dr. Salamat Ali, two authors of this report, to kindly share the report and its finding with us. Over to you, Ganesh and Salamat.
Thank you very much, Amithendu. It's always nice to be speaking at ISAS. Today we're talking about a particularly interesting topic. It's basically kind of what's happened to maritime trade in the Commonwealth since the millennium, and with some focus on South Asia. And this issue obviously is close to all of our heart, because we've had this historical road of Great Britain as a big maritime trading nation. And we've had the COVID pandemic, which has provided a huge shock on this network of trade with Great Britain in the center, but many others. And we know that South Asia has a quarter of the world's population, but only accounts for 4% of the world GDP and maybe around 3% of world trade. So we are very interested in trying to find out what happened to maritime trade in the Commonwealth context, and particularly in South Asia. Now, the challenge we had when we started thinking about this topic was that there isn't very much data that systematically tries to dissect the issue. So Brendan, Salamat, and I, with some help from some able research assistants, built a database and started looking at the literature to try to understand this question in a kind of a greenfield research manner. Next slide, please. We essentially tried to do 4 things in this study. One is we tried to look at patterns of maritime trade, looking it through this proxy of maritime transport, which was a very convenient way of dissecting this issue. And we tried to look also at the particular issue of the ports, which are very important in this context, and what drives the ports, and particularly good ports versus less good ports. Then we tried to take into account this context of the pandemic and try to understand what happened to maritime trade in different countries and regions during this, particularly South Asia. And we try to identify what were the good ports versus the others in terms of factors that might influence them. And last, we tried to come up with some issues of policy and what is it we should do to continue what some people are talking about as a nascent recovery in maritime trade. Now, in today's presentation, I will present some highlights with some respect to South Asia, and Salamat will talk particularly about COVID and the policy implications from what we've come across. Next slide, please. Now, here's a kind of a snapshot of maritime trade in the Commonwealth. As the chair observed, the Commonwealth has a strong maritime presence. Some 47 of the countries of the 54 have maritime coastlines. The oceans domain is 1.3 times the land area, so it means a huge ocean area. And there are 184 seaports across the Commonwealth, which is about a fifth of the world. And 18 of those seaports are really amongst the world's top on what they call the Lloyd's list of 100 ports. The Commonwealth also has 20% of the world's registered merchant ships, and they handle some 18% of global container traffic. Now, it's not just a story of large ports and large countries. Small countries and small ports have also had a very interesting record, and Jamaica and Malta are particular ones that stand out. And there are other aspirants. In South Asia, we have Maldives, which is trying to be an interesting port. So what this really means is that scale matters, but there are other factors that also might come into play, particularly if you're part of shipping networks. Next slide, please. Here is one of the stylized facts, and this table shows you the maritime land area in square kilometers in the first column. In the second column, and the first column is really the marine area. And then you have a simple ratio of 1 divided by 2, and you look at the world ratio, which is 1.1, and the Commonwealth is 1.3. So there's much more sea area in the Commonwealth than land, and you see it across countries, and they vary and regions. And the developing part has much more than the developed part in the Commonwealth. And then if you come to South Asia, it's a pretty much a pretty equal number of land, sea to land, which is quite interesting. But in the smaller countries, say in our region, it's the Maldives, there's a massive sea area compared to the land area. And that ratio is very, very high, 20 times more or less for all small countries. I'm going to show you the Maldives figure in a minute. Next slide, please. Here is that Maldives figure. And you notice that that ratio is really some 3,000 times the land area, quite an amazing area in terms of what resources exist for the Maldives, but also that area has to be patrolled, it has to be looked after in terms of search and rescue issues, and has to be managed by the Maldivian government, which has a fairly small coast guard, if I recall it right, and not that many dedicated people with expertise on the oceans. And there are other countries with much worse ratios, if you look, Tuvalu and Kiribati, but the Maldives is certainly up there as one of the countries which has a challenging maritime area and particularly maintaining its jurisdiction. Next slide, please. Now, here is the sort of snapshot when we go, sorry, we have to go back, yeah. Next slide, please. Right. So here is the performance of maritime trade measured by maritime transport. And container traffic is the ratio that we are using in terms of indicator. And there are essentially three distinctive periods which you can see in this chart. You see the period before the global financial crisis, 2008-9. You see the period after the global financial crisis. And then you see the COVID era, and the COVID era obviously are projections. And you have a kind of a blue kind of bar, which presents the kind of developing part of the Commonwealth, including South Asia. And then you have a reddish group that has the developed part. And then there's the green line, which shows you the weight of South Asia in all of this. And really what you see is that during the kind of heyday of globalization, there was a fairly rapid push in terms of global maritime trade. In the South Asian context, it grew at some 13% a year from a low base, admittedly. And then you get to the global financial crisis period, and then the ratio kind of comes down in terms of its growth rate. But over this whole period, the millions of TEUs in South Asia goes up from 5 million to 30 million, so some 6 times. And all the indicators that we have are pointing to some sort of recovery from COVID. And if you look at the 3 bars on the far right of the chart, you're beginning to see some picture of that kind of recovery. And that also reflects what's going on in world trade. And that's an interesting point, which we shall look at in more detail in a minute. Next slide, please. Here is a chart that looks at the shares of container traffic by sub-region, and Asia is obviously the big story of what has happened in a developing Commonwealth that is becoming much more important than compared to the developed Commonwealth. And the developing part accounts for some 76% of global container traffic in the Commonwealth as a whole, all of Commonwealth container traffic. And that's a much smaller number, 24% for developed Commonwealth countries. And South Asia is seeing a big rise from 17% of the Commonwealth share in 2000 to 28% in 2019. So that's quite a big change. And when you look at some of the other groupings, you see less dynamism. Africa is there, but there seems to be somewhat of a stabilization issue. In the Caribbean and the Pacific, some of this has gone down. Next slide, please. Here is the slide I was talking about, the ports. And what we have is this network of 184 major ports that connect the Commonwealth, 1/5 of the world's seaports. And these seaports are really the backbone of Commonwealth transport systems in a very globalized maritime sea industry. And there is a core group of these seaports which are considered very important and global leaders. And these are on the Lloyd's list of 100 top ports. And in the Commonwealth context, there are a dozen of these ports which are terribly important, but there's some 18 overall that are terribly important. You can see the list that stretches from Singapore right down to Kingston. And in terms of countries, what is very interesting from South Asian perspective is that there are several ports that are important. The top number is Colombo Port, that's ranked 3rd in the Commonwealth bit of the Lloyd's list. The Indian ports come next, Jawaharlal Nehru and Mundra, 33rd on the Lloyd's list and 37th. And then you have Bangladesh's Chittagong at 58th position on the Lloyd's list of 100 ports. And then you have Karachi at 85th. So that's quite a decent presence of South Asia, but perhaps not as strong as we would like, given the weight of South Asia in global population, for instance. You see quite a bit in East Asia, which have really amongst the leaders, and you have Singapore, you have Port Kelang in Malaysia, and so those are really amongst the world's leaders when it comes to these kind of ports. Next slide, please. Now, there was a very important little sub-story of what is it that determined the performance of these ports. Now, of course, country size was a factor, because if you have a large country, you have a large population and therefore a profitable industry that the world would want to trade with, and hence the ports make sense. But it's not just about population size or even indeed economic size. Here are some of the other factors that we thought were important. And what you have is really between ports, those 18 ports I described on the Lloyd's list in the Commonwealth versus other Commonwealth ports. And what you see is these Lloyd's list ports are certainly much better connected as measured by the Liner Shipping Connectivity Index of 2019. Another important aspect is the efficiency of seaport services. And if they deliver, much better roll-on, roll-off and other types of services that are required. And what you see is a much higher weight in terms of efficiency of seaports in terms of those 18 Lloyd's list ports. The logistics is terribly important. You want to reduce the times that ships spend in ports, because that's very expensive. And also customs clearance is terribly important, get your goods out of the port into the country as a whole. And particularly this is relevant if you have participation in global value chains, where just-in-time systems of production come into play. And what you see is ports on the Lloyd's list have a higher weighting in terms of the logistics performance index than others. And then the last factor is that countries that are more open in terms of less regulations to trade and investment, measured here, of course, by the trade to GDP ratio, you have much greater openness of these ports compared to others. And we need to do much more research on this, but you get a pretty interesting picture of what matters when it comes to successful port performance. And of course, investment levels are very important, and whether you have deep water facilities is another factor. Whether you're close to shipping lanes is yet another factor, but those are factors are harder to capture in this kind of cross-country analysis. Next slide, please. A last thing I want to leave you with before handing over to Salamat is some of the interesting contours of South Asia's maritime trade. And one issue that's very interesting is this issue of transshipment trade. And we have an interesting case study of India and Sri Lanka. And really, this advantage of being a few miles off the main east-west sea route and having this problem of the Pork Straits, which are very difficult to traverse, means that Colombo Port has become a key transshipment hub for India. And essentially, this means that it's a site where many shipping lines consolidate and deconsolidate cargo for transshipment to other destinations. And so basically, the big ships bring in their large container loads to Colombo Port, unload them onto smaller ships, and they traverse the Pork Strait and other sea routes to go to India and unload there. And so some people see this as a temporary advantage, but Colombo has enormously benefited from this because the channel in Colombo Port is probably one of the deepest in South Asia as a whole. And 45% of Colombo's transshipment volumes either originate to or destined to an Adani port terminal in India. And Adani, of course, is the big Indian port operator. And in Colombo Port, recognizing the importance of Colombo to India's trade, Adani Port will come and operate the West Terminal, in the future in Colombo Port. So that will be a very important contribution, because that's a greenfield site for Sri Lanka. Another interesting thing you're getting is the landlocked South Asian countries using neighbors' ports, and they faced large trade costs. And we have the case of Nepal and Bhutan, of course. And Nepal's case, from what I understood, is they used a couple of Indian ports to send their goods out. And these ports are quite far away from Nepal and involve crossing borders as well as the transport costs. And now Nepal is looking to move some of that traffic to ports in Bangladesh and Chittagong, and I think there's another new port that's come up at the third largest port in Bangladesh, as well as 4 ports in China to reduce trade costs of using distant Indian ports. So this is another very interesting issue which affects a couple of the smaller countries. And I think the Maldives also uses certainly direct export, but they also use Colombo Port to get some of their fish out, and also ports in India. The third interesting development that's happening, and I'm sure colleagues will comment on this from a geopolitical point of view, is China has become an interesting player in South Asian ports. And that has led to a issue of regional efficiency, because some of the ports that China operates are very, very efficient indeed. But there are geopolitical tensions that have arisen because of this development between China and India, but also with the United States getting increasingly involved, particularly in the Indian Ocean. And there are at least 3 ports that are relevant here. We have Gwadar Port at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, which is the landmark project in a $62 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor, by the way, that includes export processing zones, industrial facilities, highways, and many other interesting developments in a bid to sort of make Pakistan a key hub for China trade. Then we have the Payara deep sea port in Bangladesh, which the Chinese have invested in. And from what I understand, that's a relatively recent project. And the project cost could be somewhere between 11 and 15 billion, which is huge. And then last but not least, you have this CICT terminal in Colombo Port, which has been really pivotal in enabling Sri Lanka to get into this transshipment trade to India. And it's capable of handling big ships. And it has also some amazing technologies. When I visited this terminal not so long ago, they have very efficient green cranes that use basically solar power. And that has proved enormously important for efficiency, but also other kinds of gains. And then you have, of course, the famous example of Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka that was given recently on a 99-year lease to China. And there is that narrative about Sri Lanka therefore being in a Chinese debt trap because of these types of investments. But I will let you know that essentially Sri Lanka is not in a Chinese debt trap at present. Some 10% of our debt stock is due to China, but the bulk of it is due to ISBs from capital markets. Now, of course, if Sri Lanka takes a lot of funding from China over time and those ratios rise, then there's some risk to Sri Lanka, but at present we're not. So let me stop there and hand over to Salamat to take you through the COVID period and also the conclusions. Thank you, Salamat.
Thanks, Ganesh. Thanks, Ganesh, for providing this wonderful background and discussion of the specific issue pertaining to South Asia. So before I start, let me thank the organizer for providing us this opportunity to do this joint event. So we are really excited to be part of, to collaborate on this event. And to our participants and panelists, very, very warm greeting from the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. Colleagues, as you know, the shipping and maritime is very, very important industry. So while the whole world was in the lockdown, starting from Australia to United States, ships continued to operate, ports were functional, and they were providing us essential services, food supplies, medical supplies, and played a vital role in the containment of the pandemic. But it doesn't mean this industry has not been hurt. So based on my own experience, I have been administering port operations in Pakistan before moving to the academic world. I see that normally this kind of industry is well prepared for the challenges. So I have seen the collapse of oil ship in Pakistan in 2005 and the recent fire in the ship in Sri Lanka. So this industry has handled it very well. And normally they do different kind of drills and to prepare for the disaster. But the scale and the nature of this pandemic was as such that this industry was actually caught unawares. So if you allow me this, basically this industry has faced 2 shocks. As most of us are economists, so we know that demand for shipping is the derived demand. It comes from the consumption of goods, production of goods, industrial raw materials. So in the early part of the pandemic, the demand collapsed and industry was struggling to get the demand. In the first 24 weeks, as you can see from this chart, the port calls dropped by more than 10%. And if you see the lower chart, this Baltic Dry Index, which indicates the number of port calls by the ship, it dropped by more than half. This Baltic Dry Index actually captures the movement of ships around 23 different shipping routes from east to west and other parts of the world. And it is very much representative of the whole industry. So this Baltic index dropped, and then later on, industry is in the second phase where it is struggling to manage the demand. So these were two unique kind of crises the industry has faced in 2020 and 2021. So I will try to be very brief about that and we'll discuss in question and answer session. So as you can see, the port call dropped very quickly. So one of the big issue which emerged during this period as border closed and flights were cancelled, there was crew shortage and changeover issue in that shipping sector. So as we know, most of these crew, a lot of them belong to South Asia. The shipping industry has around 1.6 million crew, and 25% originate from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Philippines, and these countries. So as these countries went to lockdown, so there was a big issue of changeover of crews. So the way this industry works, these crew work around 4 to 6 months on the ship, then they are flown back to the country for the holidays and take break. But this was a big challenge to change that, as most of the ships were not allowed to dock in the terminal. They were allowed to go to outer anchorage point. And most of the ships which were calling India and Pakistan, and they were not allowed to call at other ports because countries thought that the crew is infected and it might contaminate other people. So you might remember the UN Secretary General has to intervene into that, and IMO also intervened, and they asked countries to grant these workers a status of key workers. And some countries did that, but this issue is slightly over, but still firms are struggling with that. But that was the short-term issue. The biggest issue which we see from the impact of the pandemic, the cancellation of the port calls led to shortage of industrial inputs. There was shortage of auto part raw materials in the West, and there was shortage of chips, shortage of PPE. This actually had a long-term impact on the future of this industry because it reignited the debate about the reshoring and nearshoring of supply chains, and we are still facing this debate at different levels. There was also suspension of cruise operations, but it did not affect South Asia much, but it had implication for our Commonwealth member in the Pacific region and the Caribbean regions. But gradually, this industry has adopted very, very quickly to this kind of shock. So they use different technologies, different approaches to absorb this shock. Some countries adopted fast lanes for essential goods, food and medical supplies and PPE and these kind of goods. And there we have seen active engagement with the government and private sector. And government also provided some concessions in the form of port fees and charges. Our Commonwealth Secretariat also been very, very actively monitoring these developments. So if you go to the WTO's website, we collected the repository, all the observation measures which were different taken by countries, and we put at the website so that countries should be able to benefit from that. And we also organized some workshops for the training of custom officials. So one of these workshops was held in Pacific, in Fiji, in the October 2020, in which we highlighted the different measures taken by the countries to protect their shipping industry, protect port workers, and protect custom officials. Overall, we have seen the upsurge in digital technologies to combat this pandemic. One of the major development has been the port community system in India, which was under development for many years, but they expedited it and it was launched recently. And you can see on this snapshot, so the port community system puts most of the vessels, ship owners, and logistic network, all these agencies together. So it is a sort of single window, which single window deals with the regulatory agencies, and the port community system deals with all logistic services providers. So this has been big development to contain the pandemic. But as I mentioned earlier, this industry is now in the second phase of the crisis. And this crisis is to manage the demand. So as the economies have opened up, especially in the western part of the world, 40–50% people have been vaccinated. And there's a huge demand for manufactured goods. As these countries provided a big stimulus and they try to maintain the income level of people. So this expenditure has switched from services to manufactured goods. So people have been investing in renovation of home, construction of gyms at home, office equipment, and these kind of stuff. So this is new kind of demand which these countries are facing on east-west route. So this has led to the huge shortage of containers all over the world. So as a result of this shortage, we have seen that freight rates are skyrocketing. Especially the freight rate, as I see from Pakistan to LA, it used to be 1,000 pounds, and now firms are struggling to get the container even at the 10,000 pounds. So this rise in freight rate has big implication for our South Asian members. The reason is that around 40 to 60% of exports of all these countries is destined to the Western markets, to Europe and North America. So there's slight variation across country. If you see this table, 60% of Bangladesh is destined to Europe, and another 20% is destined to North America. And same situation for Pakistan, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. So this rising freight rate creates challenges for the competitiveness of these exports for these countries. And secondly, as Ganesh mentioned in his presentation in the beginning, so Christmas season is coming up. So these firms get a lot of demand during the Christmas season. And due to high freight rate, they will struggle to meet that demand and move toward recovery. So overall, this industry has shown resilience and it is responding back very, very quickly. And this year, they are expected to grow by 4.8%. But there's a big if and big challenges, especially about the mutation of virus. We have seen the effect of Delta virus all over the world. So there could be another round of viruses. If the developing countries are not vaccinated, there we might end up in more lethal variants, which create problems for this trade. But these are new issues, but other issues which we have seen pre-pandemic, such as US-China trade and technology conflict, and rising wave of protectionism. And recently we have seen signing of Australia, UK, and United States agreement. So all this has implication for the future of this maritime industry. And there's a big discussion going on around the rising protectionism. Yesterday at the WTO's Global Forum, Professor Simon Evinet showed the data of protectionism, so which indicate that there were 1,100 measures implemented last year, which indicates protectionism, and there were 500 measures which were indicating trade facilitation. So there's a big mismatch between that. So it seems that industrial policy is back in action, so which could have implications for this sector. And supply chain security, nearshoring of supply chain has attracting a lot of attention, as most countries have initiated review of their supply chains. We have seen the US has done 100 days review of supply chain. China has done that. And EU is also talking of strategic economy. China is talking of dual circular economy. So there's big debate about the nearshoring, which will affect future of this industry. But on the positive side, we can see this melting of ice cap and has led to opening of Northern Sea route, which could reduce the distance between South Asian countries and the European markets. But this would benefit in the long term, although this is dangerous in terms of environmental effect, but there might be some implications for maritime trade. So what we believe and what we have seen from the analysis while this paper, that conducive policies can help to harness maritime trade for post-COVID recovery and building resilience. So what type of policies we need? So basically there are two sets of issues. One is the perennial issues which South Asian countries and other countries have been facing, and that is about improving port and logistics performance and focusing on trade facilitation and trade openness. So as Ganesh has mentioned, most of the ports and which are on the light list, so they have better port infrastructures. These countries are more open to trade. So we need to work around these issues. But there's other set of current and emerging issues. One of them I just highlighted, that is regulating container freight rate, which is blowing through the roof. And there's no end in sight. We can discuss what can be done about that. And other issue which we have seen, which is also raising its head, is maritime security challenges. Because ships are connected with the stakeholders, with the freight forwarder, with port authorities, through digital means, and which provides ample opportunities for hackers to play with these issues. Then we know the world is moving toward the greener circular economy. There is a focus for greener shipping. The shipping industry contributes around 2.6% of global CO2 emissions, which is roughly equal to total emission of the Germany. So there's a big push toward greener fuel, greener form of shippings. And on the top of that, there's a push for circular economy and building the resilience. And it includes resilience of ports and resilience of supply chain and environmental resilience. So before I close and hand over to moderator, let me take opportunity to highlight the opportunities of collaboration with the Commonwealth Secretariat on analytical work. So as you know, the Commonwealth Secretariat works on the range of issues which are important for the developing countries. So we have been working on medical supplies, food supplies, tourism, all these issues which are affected by the COVID. And last year recently we did this big report on which we call biannual trade review, which looks at the impact of COVID on Commonwealth countries, goods trade, services trade, investment, and other multilateral challenges. So we produce short trade hot topics, 3,000, 4,000 words, and these are public goods. So all these knowledge products are freely available, and feel free to look into that. And if you are interested to work with us, get in touch with me and with Brendan. So we are always welcoming to partner with us. Thanks very much for listening, and I hand over back to the moderator.
Thank you, Salamat. That was very instructive, and thank you also, Ganesh. I think between the two of you, you really packed in a very large number of very important issues, and these are issues which will live with the entire prospect and landscape of maritime trade for several years. I mean, even after COVID changes its course, and even if it changes into becoming an endemic from a pandemic, the issues that you have brought on the table continue to be of a structural nature in several respects. So I think from a South Asian region perspective, as well as a broader Commonwealth perspective, these continue to remain very important. So may I now invite Professor Peggy Chen, Professor, for your comments on the report and the discussions that we have had. Professor
okay.
Chen.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks, Ganesh and Salamat, about your presentation on the report. I think it's very, very comprehensive, and also cover the pre-pandemic and also post in the pandemic, and maybe touch it on what we should do in the future. So I think next maybe I can present some from the Australian perspective, and I think there are some issues already covered by the colleagues from the Commonwealth, but I try to present some facts from Australia. So what happened to Australia during the pandemic period? Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so I just want to talk about this, and also because I think from your report, you discuss a lot about ports. So in the second part on my presentation, I will try to talk about what's the future port. I mean, if you look at 2050, what are the key elements that we should be considered? And the final part, because yes, I think the chair, Professor Paula, you mentioned I should tie some to the South Asia, and that's good. So I try to talk about the connection between Australia and India. I think that's very close, tie, especially from last year. So I will, in the final part, I will talk to you about that. Okay, so the first slide I want to show you, so Australian maritime supply chain in the COVID era. Because from your report, actually Australia, the marine and the land ratio is 1, and then we have a 98% of our trade through seaports. So you will see that the value is very high. In particular, Australia has a lot of mineral export. So our major trade partner with the Commonwealth, India is the #1, and then the UK, Malaysia, Singapore, New Zealand. Of course, from the outside the Commonwealth, China is the #1 partner, and also the United States and Japan. So during this pandemic, actually, the major challenge is the same, as the rest of the world. So we have a delays and increased shipping cost. Important actually now it's double, and the freight cost increased by 300%. And even the port cost, when the truck driver, they say when they upload a container to the truck, that also increased. So the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission already started investigation for this, increase freight cost and also the terminal cost. And because of all the constraint from port, and also recently Australia has industry actions, so they really have strike across our container ports and make the the probably 18 days to berth in Sydney, and so this is even worse. And also the Chinese, the impose a barrier, trade barrier. So for some of our export goods, stop, also maybe the high tariff. But although all these, are challenging, actually our performance is quite good. Just at the beginning, a little bit down, just the same trend as other countries. But from the second half, it really increased. And actually we achieved the trade surplus. And this is the probably the thanks to our mineral export like iron ore or coal, because all these kind of and the commodity price actually now also increased very much. Yeah. So this is showing the figures of the export import. So the trend is actually going high. The current global market challenges remain. I think Salamat already mentioned a lot. I think I just read a report. Actually, the global liner schedule reliability dropped 33.6% in August. It's continuing the delay from ports and intermodal connection. Yeah, and then also the current power shortage in China also compounds the disruption from supply side, and all the political tension impact on trade, remains. Just what you has mentioned. But because of the report, proposed some policies for moving forward for enhancing the maritime trade, also the safeguarding the maritime trade. So the next slides, I want to talk about some key elements driving for future ports. We may say like 2050. Although these elements already actually in place before COVID, but I think the COVID really, expedited to this time, the implementation. So I think, this is just, sorry for that. I have a table of the recent freight rate, but I think some already show you the very high ones. So I just skip this one. I want to talk about these three key factors driving for the future resilient ports. So first is decarbonization. Actually, it's also mentioned in the report, and the smart port concept, digitization and automation, that's also in the report. But I want to touch on the final bit, the talent workforce, because that's for the future maritime industry, even the future port in 2050. We need some skilled workforce. Yeah. I want to touch on the decarbonization first, because now shipping industry talking about the efficiency, technology, and cleaner fuels. But for ports, also try to accelerate the energy transition. I think the most development is that they use renewable energy at ports. They also try to be an energy hub. For example, the production of hydrogen or green ammonia, and becomes a hedge to port. I think you may hear about that. I will give you some example from Tasmania later. And because from World Bank recent report this year, the green hydrogen and ammonia have been identified as the most promising candidate fuels for decarbonization of maritime transport. So what's the implication for maritime trade and ports? It's not only the fuel, because it becomes a commodity. So there will be some implication for ports, because the port could be producing the hydrogen, facilitating the hydrogen trade as a commodity. They can provide services account of bunkering port for hydrogen. So it's from the production to application. They can use the hydrogen to power the port assets. So this is a hydrogen supply chain, the role for future ports. I think for South Asia, India could be the most promising candidate to produce green ammonia. And so because also it close to Singapore as a bunkering port, so they could really also provide to Singapore. And Malaysia, of course, is also the blue and green ammonia. In Tasmania, Australia, we already have the smaller port, Bell Bay, and that's a lot of industry already invest there and to produce green hydrogen, because Tasmania is the 100% green state. We use all the renewable energy. So that's why the producing the green hydrogen from here and export to Japan, to Singapore, to China. So this is the future of the maritime trade for ports. And the other element is smart ports. So Salamat already mentioned about digitization, and really COVID really speed up this process. And this is very important for future to 2050 ports. And we know Singapore is a good model planning for this. They are the new trust port, and that. But my concern is that how about those less developed countries? Could they really, they don't have any sufficient funding or expertise to move forward. So how the Commonwealth really can help those small state and small countries. But the other issue about this smart port is cybersecurity management, and this is also becomes critical. IMO has the meeting for this for shipping companies, require them to have a cybersecurity management. But for ports, IFPH already also provided the proposal to the IMO for the approval for the managing the cyber security in ports. So the third element is really a talent workforce. We need to think about, yes, a smart port concept, all the decarbonization, they're all collected together. But for ports, they are really driven by system, schedule, regulation, technology. So what kinds of workforce skill that needed for the future? And that's why the workforce challenge also become critical. Although we advocate the technology development, but we still know digitization or digital transformation is not a technology, it's also the people, and more about the people. So we need to think about different skills needed and how this future skillful workforce could be provided by the education or even the training education institutions. So this is all the skill I mentioned. I think many of you may understand all the big data analytical skill, collaboration, creativity, innovation in the digitalized ports, and also the stakeholder management. So this is a lot of technology skill and also the soft skill, the communication. So these are very important for the future workforce. And how could we really collaborate each other, with across the globe to really get all this talent workforce ready for the future. So final, I want to talk about is the Australian seaborne trade very through the Indian Ocean and maritime operation with India, because we know we have a 50% Australian export sea freight actually from our ports in the Indian coastline. So Indian Ocean coast. So the security of Indian Ocean shipping route is very vital for Australia's economic interest. And India actually is a very significant destination for Australian sea freight, especially for some coal export and also agriculture and maybe the gold, other minerals. So I think last year, 2020, the two governments already signed off the Australia-India Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative Partnership. Actually, there are 7 pillars, 7 focus to collaborate through the maritime trade operation. So my view is that this is a very good initiative, and then our government also have called for the research project to collaborate with the scholars from India and also Australia, and also maybe Southern Asia, and including Singapore, Malaysia, that we can work together on all these issues such as security, ecology, and also maybe the connectivity, maritime transport. And I think collaboration, my final remark is that, Salama, you mentioned the collaboration. This is the key to promote the maritime industry. And without collaboration, I don't think the maritime trade can really be sustainable. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chen. That was, I thought, an excellent intervention from your side, because you really packed in a very large number of very substantive issues into that intervention that you made. And I was particularly struck by the points that you made with respect to the hydrogen mode of trading and port management that you highlighted on. That's something which I really want to sort of come back to you on as we go ahead. But now, if I could have the pleasure of inviting my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jivanta Shatli, for her views on the subject. Jiva, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Amitendu, for the invitation, and to all my colleagues at ISAS. A big hello from Dublin. So from Tasmania to Ireland, quite a shift in terms of regional position. So a few comments on the report, and then sort of my take as a political scientist, and more of a focus perhaps from an IR perspective. So this is obviously a very timely report with a lot of rich data, and it comes at a moment where we as analysts, but also as simple consumers, have probably appreciated the importance of maritime trade in a way like never before. Not only has the pandemic revealed the vulnerabilities of global supply chains, but I think all of us who are not normally following maritime issues so closely would have been gripped by that week-long saga of the container ship blocking the Suez Canal, which was therefore another major wake-up call. And here in Europe, there is already panic building up in terms of the rather luxurious problem of what's going to happen at Christmas if these supply chains continue to freeze up as they seem to be doing. Now, the report makes very clear points about the importance of maritime trade-led growth, the shocks that have been felt in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008, and now the continuing global pandemic. And what we also see is that the maritime transport industry and trade flows have in fact demonstrated great resilience in the face of these major systemic shocks, perhaps more resilience than we actually expected. And this, of course, points to the positive role that governments, corporations, international institutions have played in enabling adaptability and innovation. However, and this is where I probably throw in the sort of bird's eye question, we still have to tackle the question of how and whether globalization itself has changed or is changing, despite, or maybe in fact because of the actions that have been taken by governments, corporations, and international institutions. On the one hand, we have reports that global trade is losing steam. It was a major driver of global economic growth between the early 1990s and the onset of the 2008 financial crisis. But in the 10 years since 2008, global trade has grown at a significantly lower rate. At the same time, and as we all probably know, and as the report very clearly demonstrates, there are vast areas of the world, including many of the countries in the Commonwealth, that are still waiting to globalize their economies. They're still waiting to reap the benefits of global trade. So how does the world move forward, especially since the pandemic has sort of intensified what might feel like an inflection point in terms of global development and global politics? So how do we move forward and avoid exacerbating further the divisions that we were already worrying about before the pandemic between the haves and the have-nots, or the not yet haves, or between the winners and those who feel they have been disadvantaged by globalization? Now, the vast ocean space to which the Commonwealth countries have access, and which the report details in a very accessible way, is both a massive economic asset and a complex and very expensive responsibility. Providing maritime security for coastlines, for the ports that we have heard a lot about, protecting marine areas that are many times fold, in some cases larger than the countries themselves, is a huge task, and economically perhaps not viable for probably most of the countries in the Commonwealth. However, as again, our panelists have demonstrated in some of the graphics that they showed us, maritime transport looks set to continue to be the backbone of international trade and the global economy. That's what the trends seem to be prognosing. And precisely organizations like the Commonwealth, or another venerable organization, the International Maritime Organization, are the places where the big shipping countries have great influence. And I suppose the question is, what role are they going to be playing in having a proactive role to shape rules and regulations that will make trade freer, but also fairer and also greener. I think none of us would actually question or doubt the need to find a way to reinvigorate trade, but the fundamental question is, how do we do it better than perhaps has been the case in the past? Now, since we have a number of distinguished economist colleagues on the panel and in the audience, my humble effort is to turn the context to the strategic sort of context and the strategic alignments that are taking shape within this massive maritime space. Now, almost half of the 54 Commonwealth member states are in the Indo-Pacific. And I have to confess, it was in some ways a pleasant surprise not to see the Indo-Pacific mentioned in the report. In fact, a relief maybe from the constant barrage of discussions around, is this a new or not so new strategic concept and construct? Nonetheless, I suppose what I want to put forward is the question of how do we explore the Commonwealth as a bloc or a grouping that needs to position itself within the big strategic alignments that are taking shape in the Indo-Pacific. On the one hand, there is the Quad, 4 countries, of which 2 are Commonwealth members, India and Australia. On the other hand, there is the recently formed platform AUKUS, which was mentioned by one of the presenters, 3 countries out of which 2 are Commonwealth members, the UK and Australia. So Australia seems to be really playing the big game here. While both arrangements are focused on the Indo-Pacific, AUKUS is also the one that has been depicted as a sort of reaffirmation of the so-called Anglosphere. Now, this term, the Anglosphere, has perhaps negative as well as positive connotations. And the question is, does the Commonwealth also seek to position itself as a reawakening, reaffirmation of the Anglosphere? Now, I say that because speaking from Ireland, I want to bring in a bit of the EU dimension, because the EU is also trying to position itself more geopolitically with regards to the Indo-Pacific. And just this month was the release of the much awaited EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Now, this document was a lot about trade, and that's clearly been foregrounded because the EU is the top investor, a leading provider of development cooperation, one of the biggest trading partners in the Indo-Pacific. Together, the EU and the Indo-Pacific account for over 70% of global trade, over 60% of FDI, and it goes on and on. And this is probably one of the most important trade regions for Europe with regards to the Indo-Pacific. It's the largest, one of the largest, actually second largest destination of EU exports and home to 4 of the EU's 10 biggest trading partners. Now, at the same time, this document, which is available online, points to the need for deepening and extending security partnerships. Now, the EU is always critiqued for falling short in its aspirations to play a more geostrategic, geopolitical role, but the document actually has been pointed out, does dare to make a few sort of new points that have not been the case in previous statements by the EU. It does mention very explicitly the tensions that exist with its major trading partner, China, and details the way in which the EU hopes to engage more with other as well as existing partners. And India does play quite an important role in that envisioning of the EU's role. Now, across the channel from Brussels, or rather from my position in Dublin up the road, Brexit and aspirations for a global Britain raise the question of whether the UK seeks a greater geopolitical role through the Commonwealth. And if this is so, and it certainly makes sense that they do think in that way, how does the global maritime industry factor in the risks of potential instability to be caused by all this geopolitical churning that seems to be going on, a new wave of geopolitical re-engagement by so many different players at the same time? Now, the paper or the report mentions the US-China trade conflict at various places. However, I think it's more than a trade conflict. With the US and other allies conducting freedom of navigation operations through the South China Sea, there is always the danger of an incident, an unintended accident that could potentially lead or further exacerbate the tensions that already exist. There is also a growing militarization of the ocean, where navies of the region and those outside the region but with bases in the region are investing in greater power protection or access denial capabilities. And if we just look at the issue of bases as a sort of counterpoint to ports, this has also become a hot, important, and very politically sensitive topic. In the case of India, after decades of resistance against the idea of military security arrangements, Suddenly, India today has reciprocal military logistic arrangements with 6 countries: Australia, Japan, the US, France, Singapore, South Korea. It is currently said to be finalizing a deal also with the UK. And it is something to remember that India's own membership in the Commonwealth has often been discussed precisely in terms of how useful might it be as a way to enhance India's strategic and security ties with the strategically placed ocean state members. Now, this is obviously not so straightforward, as we know and might have been following again recently the discussions about what exactly is India up to in Mauritius with regards to a particular island there and its possibilities of turning it into a naval base. Now, at the same time, as all these sort of anxieties and potential instabilities, there is also data that clearly points to the resilience of the world economy, that it is in fact stronger than we might fear. Despite calls for decoupling, China's global market share has been increasing. Despite the US-China trade war, bilateral trade with them and also with other partners like the EU, which is becoming more critical, despite that, trade with China is increasing. So I suppose the overall question, and I sort of come to my final concluding remark, is that at a time when all the major players appear to be highly invested in global trade, but they're also engaged in all sorts of contingency planning, how do the interests of the smaller and the less powerful players get heard? Not necessarily speaking of the less powerful, but one of the smaller players, perhaps just in terms of geographical size. What are the lessons to be learned from highly innovative maritime economies like Singapore? What role can India play within the Commonwealth as a sort of voice of both the global South, but also now one of the big players in great power geopolitics? And what can and what should the Commonwealth aspire to as an organization to enable the transfer of knowledge and the sharing of best practices? What has been shared by the presenters is fantastic in terms of knowledge products, but that has to be, I think, translated into academia as well as the policymaking field even more proactively. Now, one last point, which I'd be grateful to hear the comments from the presenters, is that there is a mention in the report of, in inverted commas, the Commonwealth effect on trade flows. Now, there's a footnote to something else that explains that, but I'd like to hear, what is this Commonwealth effect on trade flows? Is it potent enough to bring countries together on issues of trade and connectivity? Can the Commonwealth leverage its massive size and the oceanic reach of its membership to promote principles, rules, technologies that support openness, fairness, and sustainability, especially at the time in which we see ourselves where security alignments and strategic blocks seem to be taking shape? Thank you very much. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Jivanta. That was wonderful. I think it was wonderful to get a different perspective from what has been broadly discussed during the day today. And thank you for bringing the Indo-Pacific back into the consideration. I'm probably going to come back to you on that if we have the time. Now, what I'm going to do is that I realize we have around 25 minutes left with us for the event. And of course, I would be being extremely unfair if I don't allocate 5 minutes of the time that we have to another of my very good friends, Brendan, for wrapping up the presentation and ceremonies today. So that leaves us with a good 20 minutes to absorb and discuss and dissect more of what we have already learned today. So what I'll do is that before I have sort of put some questions to the panelists, let me also put out this request that you are most welcome, all of you who are with us today on this program virtually, to post your questions on the chat function, and we will be very happy to take those questions up from there as we go ahead. Ganesh, this is a question which is not just for you, but I think the authors of the report per se. And I'm going to come in here from a couple of points that Dr. Jivanta raised from a broader perspective. The first is that we realize that at the time when we are discussing this and the global economy is still struggling, individual economies, most of them, at least within the Commonwealth, are struggling that much more to revive a somewhat presentable, decent, workable growth trajectory. And what we also realize is that the revival of global trade is extremely important, because unless that revival happens, the question of maritime trade contributing to the economic prospects of countries and their well-beings is not really going to work out. But this is probably where I'd like to bring you into another element of your study, which Jivanta also alluded to. You mentioned the Commonwealth effect, and we have in the past seen that within Commonwealth, there are countries which have fairly large capacities within themselves, maybe in terms of unutilized economic space, maybe in terms of their ability to be innovative or creative or deploy factors of production much more actively, as opposed to the advanced economies, many of whom have reached saturation points in this regard. So what exactly is this Commonwealth effect that you have highlighted in the report? And if you'd like to elaborate it a little more in terms of how it might be virtuous, and perhaps, if you don't mind, bringing in a bit of the South Asia angle in this regard. So over to you, Ganesh, Salamat, and also to you, Brendan. I leave it to you to take this question the way you want to.
Let me be quite brief and just thank the two discussants for two very wonderful presentations, which brought, I think, a real richness to this exercise, and was very, very nice. Thank you. Let me just try to deal with a couple of the points. One is on the revival. I mean, the revival of the global economy as a V-shaped kind of storyline that is being discussed is really aspirational, I think. I mean, we may end up with different alphabetic letters. There's a piece I think I've written on the ISAT website on South Asia, and it could be a U-shaped pattern, which is sort of very flat along the bottom for some time, leading to an L. It could be a W. And I think the reason for this is that the world economy, ever since the global financial crisis, has been stuttering in different ways. And you may have very strong ups, as we are having in this year, but this may be followed by various types of shocks. I mean, we're just looking at the big shock that may occur, two big shocks. One is financial meltdown in China, which people are very worried about around this big company that is there, and the consequences of an overheating economy. And also with the US stimulus not being passed properly with Congress. So, these two shocks, if they materialize, for sure, the world economy will collapse next year, and with it, trade and maritime trade. So that's my short answer. We're still in very highly uncertain times, even though all the projections are for a very sharp up, and I would suggest a note of caution. The second brief point I want to make is about the Commonwealth effect, and I know that Salamat and Brendan will talk much more. But remember, the Commonwealth is not a trade bloc. It's not an FTA. It's not a customs union, right? It's essentially, the way I understood it, and I'm a card-carrying member, having worked with the Commonwealth for 6 years, many, many years ago, and I'm sure the definition has changed, is a set of common institutions, language, legal institutions in particular, plus certain principles that enable trade to flow along certain lines. And I'm sure Salamat and Brendan will talk much more about this. I think they probably even measured it. The very last point I want to pick up on Jivanta's point is really about this importance of Singapore and India in their own ways. And I think that's very, very instructive because you have in those two plus others real examples of good practices that can be shared. And of course, Sri Lanka, where I am, and the port sector in Sri Lanka, it's quite an impressive story that has emerged. It's 24th on the Lloyd's list, if you remember the number I showed you. And some of that is our own effort, and some of that is by attracting foreign investment and using it in a particular way. Let me please stop and bring Brendan and others into the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ganesh, and thanks our very, very interesting presenters for raising this issue, the Commonwealth effect and Indo-Pacific region. So I believe we don't get much into Indo-Pacific, these political dynamics. We keep it the discussion more around technical issues, but this is, as Jivanta has mentioned, this is a knowledge product, and we are reaching more and more to policymakers to take benefit of that. So coming to the Commonwealth effect, so this is a statistical finding which we discovered in 2015. So we had big trade report, the first ever annual trade report, which analyzed trade flows between Commonwealth countries and Commonwealth trade flows with other members in 2015. And this report was launched in Malta. What that analytical work finds that if there are two trade between Commonwealth countries and between Commonwealth and non-Commonwealth countries, the controlling for other factors, trade between Commonwealth countries is higher than between Commonwealth and non-Commonwealth, as well as non-Commonwealth and non-Commonwealth. So we digged it further down and we found that what are the reasons behind that? We used data from the UNESCO, so they have trade cost data for starting from 1995 to date. What we found that trade cost between Commonwealth country pairs are down to the rate of around 19% on average. But we recently again checked it so that whether it still holds in the data or not. And we found that last year that Commonwealth effect is around 21%. The trade cost between Commonwealth country pairs on average are less to the tune of 21%. Why that is so? As my friend Ganesh has mentioned, so Commonwealth is not trading bloc. We don't have tariff preferences on the basis of Commonwealth, but there are many other factors which are driving this trade. So we know trade works basically on the principle of relationship and connection between peoples. What are those principles of connections and relationship? That is the common language, which most of the Commonwealth countries speaks, that is English. That is common culture, that is common legal system, and that is presence of large diaspora network in between Commonwealth countries, which is driving this kind of Commonwealth effect. And we see that Commonwealth effect has been transmitted in trade in goods, trade in services, as well as in FDI. So if you do this gravity modeling exercise, sorry, I'm getting into more technical stuff. If we do this gravity modeling, you see that on average, Commonwealth countries trade around 26% more between them for controlling for other factors. They have around 27% more FDI in between them than with other countries. So these are the driving factors: common language, common culture, presence of diaspora, and other connections, which are driving that thing. So what we have been highlighting in our previous annual reports, as well as this report, that is a great opportunity, because if you see the effect of most FTAs, you don't get this kind of advantage even within the FTAs. So Commonwealth countries have this trade cost advantage of around 21% for trading between them. So they should focus on that and exploit that. So I'm sure Brennan would like to say more on this.
Go ahead, Brendan, if you have anything to add at this stage.
Thanks, Amitabh. Good morning, everyone from London. I think Salamat has captured everything. I think we should leave time for some other questions, and I have some comments at the end, which I'm very happy to share. So I'll draw together at the end. Thank you, Amitabh.
You're welcome, Brendan. Before I take the opportunity to get back to some other questions, we have a question which has come on India specifically, India's interest in supply chain resilience, the way it is looking at the developments in the Indo-Pacific, specifically the relationship, the security relationship that has emerged between Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States, the AUKUS, and of course, also the Quad. So it's a bit of a broad question to address. And Jivanta, can I ask you for your comments on this, because it's more of a geostrategic, geopolitical question. So if you don't mind.
Sure, Amitabh, but I didn't get the question actually. I mean, what is India's?
Okay, I'll let me just read out the question to you. The question is specifically India's interest in resilient supply chain alliances. How is it shaping up given the AUKUS, the Commonwealth, and the Quad vis-a-vis China?
Okay, that is a very broad and big question.
It is indeed, yeah.
I mean, from my understanding, the AUKUS arrangement is, it's very specifically with regards to nuclear technology and submarines. So it doesn't really have implications with regards to trade and supply chains. But I suppose the Quad is perhaps more relevant in that regard because it explicitly talks about things like developing resilience in particular sectors. And I think they've also spoken specifically with regards to creating this vaccine partnership. And I think that has highlighted perhaps in ways in which the rest of the world was not aware of India's critically important role in that particular supply chain of pharmaceuticals and vaccine production. So I think, the geopolitical background, which is enabling perhaps the strategic alignment and providing momentum for specifically, say, India-US convergence, is also having then an impact on specific supply chain issues. And I would say the pharmaceutical sector is a really good one to be looking at in that case. And, just to flag India a little bit more, I also wonder how much of the Commonwealth effect that was just described is down to the India-UK relationship. How much is that skewed by that one particular relationship? So I'll leave it at that just to keep it a little bit minimal.
Yeah. No, I think that's very sort of instructive in the sense that you allude to the relationship that India has with Commonwealth countries, and you mentioned UK. I think it's also important that apart from the initiatives that it is currently subscribing to insofar as increasing the supply chain resilience and its participation in the Quad is concerned, India's upgraded strategic relationships with countries like the United Kingdom and Australia are clearly reflective of the importance that it attaches to the Commonwealth at a certain level. I mean, perhaps it is not entirely homogeneous at this level, but this is also indicative of the fact that the intra-Commonwealth synergies are really strong. And there are members with the Commonwealth who can, between themselves, galvanize a large amount of economic complementarities to get the revival going at their own level. And these are all major economies and very important middle powers. Let me continue, Professor Chen, on a question which has been there on my mind. And I wanted to allude to one point that Salamat made in his presentation, that, this is the melting of the Arctic ice, the opening up of the northern shipping routes. Certainly, they're going to bring down shipping costs, and more so for South Asian countries, but at what cost? I mean, there's that critical growth versus environment trade-off, which is coming in, something which has been at the back of the minds of people, planners, development experts for a long time. In Australia, I know there has been this very, very major concern over balancing environment, the green fundamentals and sustainability with higher maritime trade. How do you look at this suggestion by Salamat, the point that he has brought on the table? Do you think that this might work in future and it can happen in a sustainable fashion?
You mean the Arctic shipping or?
Yes.
This is a very interesting question. Yes, it's going that way, but actually, I don't know how could we estimate the environmental cost. It's a similar way if you look at now everyone talking about the net zero 2050, and then how about Australian coal industry? So there are different things we need to think about. But my view is that shipping route is a new opportunity for shipping companies and also for the consumers or maybe the transportation, because that's a shortcut. But I don't have any data showing the cost, but from my personal view, actually, I don't really think that's the sustainable way to do, because yes, ice is melting, but all the environment, the species and all the animals or anything there. And also even in the winter time, they need more equipment and then the different type of ships. You know, even IMO, they have an ice break, you know, the so-called polar code, you know, for facilitating all the shipping. I think that if you add up all the costs, to me, I think it's far more expensive compared to, although I don't have any data, but from my colleagues' conversation that from the navigation part, I think this is one part. But my concern is really the environmental impact is a big issue. But I mean, touch down what Amitendo, you mentioned about this. It's the other night we talk about environmental issue. For the Commonwealth, the small country, especially Pacific Island, I want to turn to that point because I remember that Vanuatu president questioned the Australian, you know, the prime minister, saying that because in the parliament they show the coal mine, say, oh, don't scare about that. But you know, the president from Vanuatu, that's a Commonwealth, you know, member, saying that yes, you are doing that for your economy, but I'm saving my people in this island. So you see that is the contradiction between the economic development of the, you know, the trade and also the environmental issue. So this is a very interesting part, and I just want to really give you this example. To me, it's very hard to estimate the environmental cost. Yeah.
No, I think I entirely agree with you, Professor Chen. I think when we take this issue up front, we sometimes don't understand the implications of it, which are very granular. But then when we look at the prospects of reviving maritime trade, and which is intricately linked to the way global trade shapes and functions, we realize the downsides that might be associated with it. And it's a tough call to take for many countries and many regions. There are two quick questions that I'd be grateful if the panelists could respond to before I hand over to Brendan. The first question is on the coastal shipping's role in maritime trade in the Commonwealth, and particularly among countries in the Asia-Pacific, and what potential it might hold in the post-COVID world. And the second question is on the strength of the maritime law in ocean protection in the region. Again, this would be up your street, Professor Chen, following the oil spills and the fire in the Sri Lankan waters. So I just share these questions with you broadly, and please let me know who might want to answer this. Ganesh, you want to reflect on coastal shipping?
So may I clarify, the coastal shipping here is talking about the within a nation, or is it across the country, because that's a different definition here?
Yes. My sense is that this is more on the question of coastal shipping with respect to the particular long coastline that big countries have, and to what extent that coastal shipping, in terms of, you know, the inter-haulage movement, can create an impact, or along sometimes the rivers that we have, particularly in South Asia or Southeast Asia, where there's a connection between the sea and the river, and the coastal shipping can offer sufficient economic opportunities. So do you see this becoming an important factor going ahead, Ganesh or Prof. Chen?
So just very briefly, I mean, the example of Bangladesh for the inland waterway story comes to mind. I think there are probably largely traditional shipping systems in place. I don't think it's a modern shipping system. I think you have these steamers that do a lot of the heavy lifting, and these are, you know, fairly slow barge type vessels that probably transport goods and people across fair distances. But I don't think it's a very developed or very efficient system. It's probably a technology that comes to the immediate post 70s, 80s kind of technology, right? So clearly there is some room for upgrading it. But I suspect it's really the cost of land transport versus sea transport question that will come into play, and whether the capital cost of getting the more modern shipping systems can be there. That's within country. The example which is kind of coastal shipping is the India-Sri Lanka transshipment story I talked about, because India, as you may know, to go from one part of India to the other part of India, you have to cross the Pork Strait. And that's a problem for India, because the Pork Strait has very shallow waters, right? So that's the water that, by the way, separates India and Sri Lanka, and a lot of the Indian shipping has to go via that Pork Strait. And that's really what I understand from the geographers, that's the big advantage of Sri Lanka in this transshipment trade, that the big ships can come to deepwater Colombo port, which has a very deep channel in its main channel, unload and move to India. So that's kind of an example of sort of semi-coastal shipping, if you like, because Sri Lanka-India distance is not very much.
Yeah.
So those are the two I can think of. I hope that answers.
Okay, so maybe Ganesh, I can intervene a bit here. I think this issue of coastal shipping is also emerging a lot during this period of pandemic. What we see in this industry, they call it not only multimodal transport. So ship might call at one deep port in Sri Lanka or India and Mumbai, and then there are smaller feeder vessels that will take that cargo to the other ports in that country. Because most of these big vessels, what we call them mother vessels, which carry around 25,000 containers, they can't be docked at these smaller ports and which have less draft. So they will call it one big port, and then the smaller vessel will take their cargo to other. But the industry is taking steps toward that also, and they are also adding other elements of multimodal transport. That includes inland transport, through railways, through trucks. So now they are moving towards providing full solutions from door to door, maybe from factory to consumer. So you can see these kind of development happening through the port community system. So you get one point solution. You don't need to hire truck logistics systems. The shipping industry is getting ready to take care of all the whole supply chain from A to Z.
May I have one comment? Sorry,
yeah,
may I have one comment on this?
Very briefly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, because I think I probably look at that because Australia really we have a lot of coastal shipping because the big island and also across the Pacific Island. But I think for the future, because everyone knows the technology development, for coastal shipping, probably the opportunity for using autonomous ships, because that will increase efficiency. That's the future, because Norway already starting doing that. So I think that's the opportunity for especially the coastal shipping in the Pacific Island or anything. But of course, that needs help from maybe the Commonwealth Organization or other country with expertise. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Chin. I think important insights. And Ganesh, the point that you raised over ships having to cross into Sri Lankan water is a result of what, as you know, are restrictive cabotage laws, as we mentioned in India, which of course have changed, by the way. So now it is no longer really necessary for ships to cross into that extraterritorial water, at least not for all kinds of ships. But having said that, I think this very interesting geography between a country like India and Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka being an island country with excellent port facilities, India having a very long coastline with complicated regulations in parts of it. There are very interesting opportunities that can be produced by imperfections as well. So that's something that we need to look into. I'm afraid, given the time that we have, we really can't take more questions because I am aware of my commitment to Brendan. So Brendan, you need to come in now. And if I could request you to keep yourself very tightly compressed to 5 minutes. There you go.
Thank you, Amithendu. Good morning again to everyone from London. So I really hope today's discussion has highlighted the importance of the Commonwealth in global maritime trade as we've set out in this paper. Although, as we've heard, there is wide variation among our members, both in terms of their levels of engagement in maritime trade and also the efficiency of port operations. But overall, we are a blue Commonwealth, and this opens up a range of exciting possibilities for harnessing the ocean economy for sustainable development and also to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And this will become ever more important as we seek to build back better and build back greener and build back bluer from the pandemic. So in that regard, I also just wanted to add that our Commonwealth Blue Charter is promoting dialogue, cooperation, and sharing of best practices to build and conserve a sustainable blue economy. So, Amitendo, I just wanted to conclude with three broad observations from today's webinar. So the first is the potential for growing intra-Commonwealth trade, including by harnessing this Commonwealth advantage that we've spoken about. In 2018, our Commonwealth heads of government set a long-term vision to grow intra-Commonwealth trade to $2 trillion by 2030 and to strengthen connectivity among Commonwealth countries as well as their global trading partners. And since trade is mostly seaborne, we believe that a more coordinated effort at Commonwealth and national levels to formulate an agenda for maritime trade-led growth will contribute towards achieving this target. Just as an aside, we heard about the Commonwealth advantage, and particularly when it comes to services, we believe this will be particularly pronounced given the use of English among all our trading partners, the prevalence of the common law tradition, and also familiar legal and administrative systems. And so digitalization particularly offers an opportunity of connecting us, particularly through mode 1, which was previously not necessarily the case. So second, since Asia and also the Pacific remains highly dependent on overseas markets and very closely connected to the global economy through global value chains, the shipping and logistics sector will need to adjust and prepare for post-pandemic recovery. So we've heard about some of these reforms from Salamat, from Ganesh, but I'd specifically like to highlight 5 issues. The first is the greater use of technology and digital tools to build smart port and automated ports, and we've just heard about automated shipping. The second is more focus on increasing resilience and robustness of operations to wide-ranging risks, including from pandemics. Third is the higher focus on port safety and security. Fourth, greater use of integrated transport systems and inland transport operations. We've just heard here about intermodal as well. And fifth is the supply chain configuration and design that may change port network configurations. So finally, I think a very important factor is also the human story, the human factor concerning the health, the welfare, and the professionalism of the unsung heroes of this crisis. And I'm thinking about the estimated 1.6 million seafarers globally, and especially those that remain stranded on their vessels at sea, where estimates are up to 200,000, thankfully come down to around the 400,000 that we heard at the height of the crisis. And India is one of the world's largest sources of sea crew. Estimates are about 240,000 people from India that serve on vessels globally. And this meeting really takes place at an opposite time, because yesterday, in an open letter to the heads of state attending the UN General Assembly, the International Chamber of Shipping and other industry bodies warned of a global transport collapse if governments do not restore the freedom of movement to transport workers and give them priority to receive vaccines recognized by the World Health Organization. So as we've seen in the UK and elsewhere, global supply chains are fragile and our unsung heroes are really at breaking point. So this will inevitably delay recovery from the pandemic. So from my side, let me just conclude by also sincerely thanking our presenters, our discussants, and you, Amitendo, our chair. Most importantly, our participants for joining us for today's conversation. And just on behalf of our Secretary General, also to express our sincere thanks to the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore for yet another splendid cooperation to deliver today's event. So we do look forward to continuing this collaboration. So thank you very much, and back to you, Amitendo.
Thank you, Brendan. That was lovely. That was wonderful. In fact, very powerful words that you said, words that will resonate in respect of the importance of the issues that you highlighted, and of course, the spirit of collaboration. I really look forward to our institute and the ComSec engaging much more. And we have very good, trusted colleagues who are on both sides, if they don't mind my saying so. My very good friend Ganesh, for example, is with us, is with you as well. So I think the bridge building has been complete. And I am aware of the fact that we are approaching dinner time in Singapore, and we have encroached into dinner time for Professor Chen, if I'm not wrong. So thank you for bearing with us and keeping all of you away from food for some time. It's been a fantastic discussion, and I'm sure it's just the beginning, because the maritime trade subject is something which is going to capture our attention for a very, very long time. Over to you, Shavanya.
Our thanks to the chairperson and panelists for an insightful and engaging session. Special thanks to the Commonwealth Secretariat for partnering ISAS in this joint panel discussion. We look forward to your participation in our upcoming events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care.